I do apologize. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Lessons in Courage and Sound Judgment from the Rise and Fall of Theranos. I'm sure you had an opportunity to read that slide, but I'll go through the details very quickly for you, and I apologize. Today's presentation is worth 1.5 CPE credits. Please answer at least 5 of the 6 polling questions and have a total viewing time of 75 minutes. You can track that on your computers. Participants will receive a CPE notification email when CPE credits are available, typically 7 to 10 business days. We are unable to grant CPE credit in cases where technical difficulties preclude eligibility. CPE program sponsorship guidelines prohibit us from issuing credits to those not verified by the technology to have satisfied the minimum requirements as stated. And in accordance with the standards of the National Registry of CPE Sponsors, CPE credit will be granted based on a 50-minute hour. And now to introduce our moderator today, Elizabeth French-Pospick. She's the director of Baker Tilly and FEI Dallas's Special Events Chair. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Nancy. I really appreciate it, and welcome everybody here for our Dallas Summer Chapter Series. And I want to extend a gratitude and appreciation for Nancy Ellers and Jackie Dunn for helping put all of this together. These webinars help to break up our work week, provide some contact with others outside the world, and also provide great CPE that keep us up to date with the outside world and what's going on. When we're all in our remote working environments, or most of us are still working remotely, or even feel like we're working remotely, even when we're in an office. So we're very grateful for your help in putting this together. Thank you very much. This session is brought to you by our education sponsor, the University of Dallas. And we want to extend appreciation to the University of Dallas for their sponsorship, and encourage each of you that are attending this seminar and involved in FEI to consider the University of Dallas for educational needs, as well as for hiring for your company employees. Further, I want to encourage you to reach out to the University of Dallas to see how you can help. I've become quite well aware lately how much the professors are looking for help with their classes and with getting people involved and encouraging people to go back and get their degrees. So you can help improve the lives of others and make an impact by using the University of Dallas. I want to say thank you to Rebecca Almanza for her relationship with FEI. She is the Director of Corporate and Community Partnerships, and this includes external relations and strategic engagement. She's been involved with the University of Dallas since 2015 and has been very helpful in putting this all together. Brett Landry, I also want to introduce you to Brett Landry and say thank you to him too. He's the business dean and specializes in cybersecurity as a practitioner and educator. He's also an international lecturer. As dean, he serves as the chief academic officer for the college that offers bachelor's, master's, and doctoral business degrees, and an executive education program. Uniquely, DCEO magazine recognized Brett's work at the University of Dallas by honoring him in both 2019 and 2020 in the Dallas 500 list of the most influential business leaders of Dallas-Fort Worth. That's a very awesome award. Thank you very much. And to that, I will pass this on to Brett to talk about the school.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so much, and welcome everyone virtually. I'd love to have everyone on campus right now at the University of Dallas, but with COVID, this is the next best thing, but we look forward to engaging everyone at a future date. As Elizabeth mentioned, we are always looking for engagement from business executives onto campus. So if you'd like to be part of our executives in campus program, please reach out to us. You can reach out to Rebecca, reach out to myself. My email address is very simple. It's cobdean@udallas.edu. And having practitioners on campus is very important to us. It's part of our hallmark. In the 1960s, there were not practice-based nights and weekends MBA programs for working professionals. They were very much daytime programs that used case methods and used textbook examples. And in 1966, we began the Graduate School of Management, now the Gupta College of Business, to have a practitioner-focused nighttime, weekend, online program. And where a lot of the universities right now are having to face a scramble to get online, we've been doing an online MBA program since 2000 that's been supported 24/7. So it's something that we're very familiar with. If you're looking for training for your employees with Masters of Science or MBA programs, please let us know. But also how we can be connected with your lifelong learning and continuing education process. Be glad to talk to you more about that with you. Thank you all today.
Thank you, Brett. Appreciate that. And without further ado, I'll get us headed toward our program, but I want to introduce our speakers. John Kaisersot, I'm sure I'm going to mess that one up. And
you got it
Brett,
just right, Kaisersot.
I did, Kaisersot, good. And Brett McDaniel. We have some very qualified people speaking with us today. John has been with an adjunct faculty member of the University of Dallas. He also practices as an attorney with Ferguson, Braswell, Fraser, Kubasta, which is easier said FBFK. And he's taught business ethics to undergraduates at the University of Dallas and business and society to graduate students at the University of Dallas. He's organized and facilitated business ethics case studies and forums and workshops for executives and young professionals for over 10 years. He's practiced law for 24 years in law firms and a Fortune 500 company. With his business, ethical, and legal expertise and diverse background, John helps clients make wise, ethical, and practical decisions. And one of the things I think you'll find in this course today is how practical the things that we're discussing today are in your everyday work life. Hopefully some of them not quite so everyday. John has a BA in International Relations from the University of Southern California and his JD from the University of Texas School of Law and his MBA from Texas Christian University. Just to give you a little bit of the experience of Brent McDaniel, who also has an extensive experience both in the US and overseas. Brent's a member of KPMG. He's a managing director with foreign services practice and specializes in ethics and compliance investigations and related issues. I noticed back there he's got quite a bit of experience. He is a CPA. He's got his bachelor's from the University of Oklahoma. Our Texas residents will forgive him for that one for right now. But he's also got his AICPA certified in financial forensics. He is currently the managing director of KPMG and has a broad experience in high-profile projects for boards and directors and corporate execs and their legal counsel. And these projects have included enhancement or remediation of ethics and compliance programs, managing third-party risk, investigations, related remediation, and compliance and anti-corruption. As I said, Brent has worked both in the US and also worked in London for 4 years, which I'm sure was quite a bit of a great experience. And Brent was also a special agent, so he may not be able to tell us everything he knows. Without further ado, John and Brent, thank you very much for presenting to us today. We totally appreciate you being here.
Thank you. So there's our title. We can go to the next slide. We're happy to be here with you. And because we have a lot of material and because you've heard a lot about us already, we're not going to tell you any more about us. But in the small print here, I'm going to go ahead and read this. This is pretty standard fare that people do. Normally government people, they say that my opinions are not the opinions of the government. But the thing is, we're dealing with real situations here. So I'm going to read this, real people and real situations. So the descriptions of the historical events in this presentation are based on descriptions publicly stated in the media and are not based on any other direct or indirect knowledge of such events. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers or those expressed by the media sources on which they have relied and do not necessarily reflect the views of FBFK, KPMG, the University of Dallas, Financial Executives International, or other members of those organizations. As this presentation touches upon the wisdom and ethicality of actions taken by real persons in real situations, of which the speakers necessarily have only limited publicly available knowledge, the speakers wish to emphasize to the audience that facts and circumstances unknown to the speakers may have bearing on the actual ethical or prudential quality of such actions. In other words, We don't know everything, and though we may have the facts that have been reported to us and draw conclusions on the basis of that, we're very hesitant to evaluate a person's actual sense of prudence and good judgment because we just don't know everything that they took into account or everything that they experienced. With that, we can move on. And one of the things that we got to start, yes, with our first question.
Thank you very much, John. Your first question, folks, on the poll. Oh, look at this. Ethics consists primarily in following ethical rules, doing what results in the most benefit for most people, becoming an excellent person. I'll give you just a few seconds to think those answers through. I have to say our poll questions are very thoughtfully provoked, so feel free to take a few extra seconds. Okay, I'm going to end that poll and show you your results. And there you go, John.
Great, great. Well, that's very interesting because that's, as we in the financial industry, we have lots of rules. Or rather, I'd say you have lots of rules. I'm in the legal industry where we have lots of rules and we make rules. But rules are part and parcel of our system. And it's very interesting that in the American society, there is how we view ethics is a set of rules. How we practice ethics tends to be a little bit different. We tend to make decisions, you know, yes, we follow the rules, but we tend to make judgments and decisions based on what seems to have the best results, right? So we're results oriented in making decisions. We look at the consequences of decisions. And there's this other ethical approach that we're going to be dealing with today that is ancient and current, which is an approach called virtue ethics that says, what kind of person am I becoming by the actions that I take? We're not talking about following external rules as much as we're talking about being a moral person, right? And moral is not just that you stay out of trouble, but it's actually that you thrive as a person by being excellent at what you do and morally excellent with the way that you treat other people. Okay, so we'll start with, rather than getting too deep in philosophy, before you all turn your mutes on, mute your speakers, let's let Brent get into Theranos and tell a story about what happened there.
Sure, yep, happy to, John. And can you hear me okay? Just making sure,
yes.
Double check. Okay, great. So, and again, this is going to be a very high level timeline of the events at Theranos, and they're, again, limited on what's, of course, public record. There's a lot out there that no one quite knows yet that will likely come out in the trial that's supposed to happen early in 2021, which I'll tell you more about in a minute. But basically, the company was founded in 2003 by Elizabeth Holmes. She, at the time, was at Stanford University, and her original idea for what the company would achieve or the technology it would create was a patch that a person could put on their skin and would diagnose and treat health issues. So she dropped out of college at the age of 19 to pursue this idea. At the time, she actually, this will become important as we go through the story, she actually consulted other people at Stanford, which is obviously well known for its academic prowess and you know, the bright people that it has on staff, professors and other PhDs. So she consulted a PhD who told her that her idea was completely impossible, that it wouldn't work. She chose to ignore that advice and start the company anyway. So not very long after she dropped out of Stanford, she found out that actually that patch wasn't really possible, that it was a lot more difficult than she thought. And she came from a background, and there's a great book called Bad Blood, which if you want to read, will take you through this in great gory detail, which I'm giving you the high points of. But she came from a background of wanting to change the world, but also desiring to be financially successful. She was a very driven person and felt like that this patch idea had legs. Well, when that fell through, she then pivoted to the idea that she would revolutionize healthcare by making blood testing procedures less expensive and more convenient, and maybe as importantly, in her eyes, less painful. So she sort of envisioned a world where people could prick their finger and with a drop of blood or two, run all of the tests that a usual phlebotomist draw, where they're taking, you know, whatever, a significant amount more blood. I'm not a medical professional, but, you know, maybe a pint of blood or whatever the number is. You know, usually that's the requirement, right? You'd have to get stuck by a needle, take a significant amount of blood, then they would run the tests and they would have to send it to a lab. Her view was that she, in each person's home, could create a blood testing device that was small, that could sit on a countertop or wherever else, and that the results could be interfaced with the person's doctor so that their medication could be changed, that health problems could be identified, and in her words, later, much later, not 2003, but later, no one would have to lose a loved one too soon. That was her view. That was sort of the goal she set for herself, and she wanted to sort of disrupt the industry in that way. So she pitched that idea over a number of years to several high-profile investors, which I won't, you know, go into the long list of. Originally in 2004, she was able to raise almost $7 million on a valuation of about $30 million. Again, by sort of word of mouth, her kind of magnetic personality, and this vision that she had that people really seemed to buy into, in many cases on its surface. And obviously they could see the commercial uses for this technology very quickly if it was possible to be created. So in 2004, she raises about $7 million. Then in 2007, the company's valuation hits about $200 million. And they'd spent 3 years of early round fundraising by that point. So they had obviously gone, you know, had sort of by 5 or 6 times multiplied the value of the company via representations that Elizabeth Holmes was making about their progress in getting to this device, blood testing device. Importantly, during that 2004 to 2007 period, Holmes made a pretty significant HR decision in firing her then CFO, Henry Mosley. So November of that year was a sort of an interesting litmus test for the company. They created or conducted a test for Novartis in Switzerland, and the test did not go well. The machine malfunctioned, and they ultimately transmitted a fake test result from Palo Alto to Switzerland to appear as if the machine had conducted the analysis on site and in a number of minutes created reached those results. Mosley found out about this and confronted Holmes, and she fired him basically on the spot in November of 2006. Importantly for this audience, they never appear to have hired another CFO throughout the life of the company between then and 2018. So there's a period of time, there's a lot of early fundraising through about 2010. In 2010, there's a SEC form that's filed that claimed they had raised another $45 million and valued the company at $1 billion. Much of that valuation was based on revenue projections they had created in Excel spreadsheets that Elizabeth Holmes and her number 2 in the company, number 2 executive, Sunny Balwani, also her boyfriend, created in Excel based on the idea that they were going to sell these machines to the US military, to a variety of pharmaceutical companies, as well as consumer retail companies. Interestingly, it doesn't appear, and again, I don't know the details of this, but the details behind those projections, when asked, Balwani would get upset and yell and scream at people, often fired people for asking about the legitimacy of the numbers when employees would test him. So it's not 100% clear where they got to the valuation. And during that period of time, as well, there's sort of a rotating door of employees. It was very common in the company for employees to hire on from other Silicon Valley startups, and even from places like Apple and other well-established companies, and to last a short amount of time before realizing that they had concerns and either quitting over those concerns or raising them and being fired. So that will become, John, as we talk through this, that'll become an important piece of information. In 2013, Theranos finally announced itself to the public. They had sort of, I think, for about a 10-year period, kind of flown underneath the radar in terms of public profile. As I said, most fundraising was, well, all fundraising was private. They had conversations with individual potential business partners, but not created a marketing campaign or attempted to make themselves public. At that point, though, they sort of came out of their sort of self-created cocoon and unveiled this professionally designed website by a very well-known marketing company. Holmes began a sort of a marketing campaign that involved, constant speaking, public events, charity galas, and so forth. She became really overnight a sort of a celebrity, and began to really become even more connected with a broad range of high-profile people. Later that year in September, Theranos announced a Walgreens partnership where Walgreens would open within its stores clinics that would use the Theranos tests for the public. And that was really its sort of first foray into commercialization of the technology. And that announcement, as well as an announcement about a potential partnership with Safeway and some others, drove Theranos value, at least for the outsiders, through the roof. I mean, they hit $9 billion in 2014. Again, lots of media, lots of high-profile events, lots of speeches, TED Talks, and other things that Elizabeth Holmes did throughout the sort of 2014 period. And Fortune announced at that point they'd raised nearly $400 million, which made Holmes a multi-billionaire because at a $9 billion valuation, she owned, at the time, 50% of the company. So really, there was a significant focus on Holmes as really this Silicon Valley entrepreneur, especially, young woman who had dropped out of school with this great vision of helping people live better, live longer, have less painful medical tests, and so forth. And really, that began to fall apart a little bit in 2015. And John, I'll wrap up here in just a second, let you jump in. There was a first piece that was penned in the Journal of American Medical Association that really raised some questions about the fact that there had been no research, peer-reviewed, and there were just the first sort of critical articles were being written in the medical community at that point. At that point, most people, I think a lot of people, saw Theranos sort of appears as a sort of tech startup. And it prided itself on having an interface that looked like, an iPhone or an iPad. And there was a lot of hype around, Holmes and her image and so forth. And at this point, though, things began to focus more on the underlying claim of what the company could do and the fact that it really was a healthcare company at its core. And later that year is, in October of 2015, is really when the dam started to break more on investigative reporting, and that the book Bad Blood was not published then, but later. But the author was a Wall Street Journal investigative reporter, published his report on October 15th and 16th, and then really for a number of days, there was sort of bombshell reports that came out about ex-employees' views of the fact that the technology didn't really exist, it didn't work as promised, and that basically the public and society had been fooled by Holmes and Balwani. At least that was the claims in the Wall Street Journal articles. They're still out there if you wanted to go read them. But there were, as a result of that report, the FDA investigated, CMS investigated, basically shut down their use of the nanotainer that held the blood during testing, and for all intents and purposes said that their tests were an uncleared medical device and that they were not validated at all. So the company began a sort of downward spiral from there. The Safeway deal folded in November, which was a $350 million deal that was no more. In late December of that year, Wall Street Journal again published another article claiming that they had rigged tests for a number of years. And so it just sort of begins to spiral. In early 2016, Walgreens suspended their partnership with the company. And then in 2017, it's really sort of a case of many, many investor suits, litigation, settlements, and lots more information coming out about alleged fraud, mismanagement, and sort of lies and dishonesty within the company. Until in March 2018, both Holmes and Balwani were charged by the SEC with what they called a decades-long fraud against investors, where they made false statements, exaggerated what their technology could do, and so forth to raise funding. Holmes at that point was stripped of control of the company, returned her shares, and was barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company for 10 years. Subsequently, in June, both she and Balwani were indicted on wire fraud charges, and they're still currently waiting trial now. It was supposed to have happened in July or August. It's been delayed until March 9th of next year, just due to COVID. And they're both facing 20 years in prison and millions of dollars in fines. And of course, in late 2018, the company completely folded, leaving its employees without jobs and those holding investments and or other shares basically with nothing. It's been estimated that Holmes raised and spent about $1 billion of investor money during that 15-year run. And in case anybody wondered, by the way, Holmes and Balwani did end up breaking up in about 2019, it appears. So they're not together anymore, just morbid curiosity. John, there's some themes that come out of all of this. Do you want to cover some of those? That's the high level sketch. Hopefully I hit most of the points. I tried to stay out of too much detail, but it's important, I think, to know some of that.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. It's a great description. I especially like the fact that you gave it a description from the outside. And some questions have come up on the Q&A board about where was the board, where is the FDA, where were the state regulators, and those are great questions. So one thing I want to say is that we're open to questions throughout the presentation. We have a lot of material that we're going to try to cover, and so that means we won't be able to answer all the questions that you ask, but we will be able to answer any questions that we don't answer during the session. We can follow up by email and answer for you, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be taking a little look at the theoretical side of this, because this is an ethics program. So we have to ask, what is ethics all about, right? And how are we approaching it here, right? And so ethics is what? It's about right and wrong, right? It's about oughtness. What is the behavior that is most fitting for human beings? And you might say, well, wait, we just need to obey the laws and follow the regulations and follow the rules. Well, where do we get those rules and where do we get those laws? We get them from people thinking hard and long about what is the most fitting way for human beings to behave and to treat one another. So ethics is not only about rules, and it's not only about ethical dilemmas. We might think about ethical dilemmas as, what does Tyler Schultz do when he discovers what's going on at Theranos, which we'll talk about. But it's also about how we live our lives, right? Who we become through what we do, right? Are you a good person? Are you a bad person, right? Being the best version of ourselves, as we often hear. And not just a technical sense of being technically adept at getting things done, but in a moral sense. Are you a good person? Do you improve people's lives? Do you do the right thing, right? Not am I good at accomplishing things, which is technical ability, which is very important, of course, and very good. But ethics is more about, am I doing the upright and morally fitting thing? Morally excellence, right? We classically call that virtue. right? Which is, it's a word that maybe isn't fully understood these days, but virtue would be basically a good habit of character. And we're going to talk about a couple of these habits of character today, and how they will help us if we develop these habits of character to make ethical decisions, to make good decisions, even on the technical side as well. Okay, so we had the survey of views of ethics, and one's rule-based, one is the pragmatic cost-benefit analysis, and which we would call, the philosophers would call consequentialism. And then there's virtue ethics, and it's based on the sense of what is a human being and what's the nature of a human being, and therefore what is fitting for a human being to do himself or herself and to do to other people. And we know about human beings, one is that we're intelligent. We have a mind that can dream, that can plan, that can design, that can do all kinds of things that other minds in the world can't really necessarily do. And so human beings are rational and they're free. In other words, we are self-determining. We choose what we do, and therefore we have moral responsibility for our actions. Why? Because that fact that we choose what we do, it gives us we take on responsibility for what we do. And the third aspect of what is in the nature of human beings, you know, we're intelligent, we're free and responsible, and we're social. We're human beings that none of us goes through life alone as an island to ourselves, from infancy through death, right? We're always working with other people, and we're always in part supported by and giving support to other people. And so we are by nature social creatures. We need each other, and not just we need each other to get by. We also need each other in the sense that when we look at the questions that are so often asked these days about meaning and purpose and work, well, meaning and purpose and work often come from the fact that we're improving the lives of others, that we have a purpose that's beyond ourselves, something bigger than ourselves that we collaborate for, and all of that. And why does that seem right to us in our guts? Because we are social creatures. We naturally are inclined to want the good of the people around us. Now, not everybody behaves that way, and not everybody necessarily feels that way, but it is a natural tendency that human beings in general have. Okay, so we as human beings thrive in a healthy way when we are tending towards finding meaning and purpose, which we do by using our freedom to do good, right? And by using our intellect to invent, to make life better for people, right? And then we're collaborating with other people. So then you have the intellect, the freedom, and the social nature. Okay, so in this model of ethics, you're doing good when you are living in an excellent way. And there's certain virtues that we call them habits of character. And you think about it, you might think of somebody who is who can't control themselves and their actions. For example, it sounds like Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani were so determined to change the world for the better with their medical devices that they didn't mind defrauding their investors, lying to regulators, and all the different things that we read about in the press that they did in the way that they treated their employees, as we read about in some of the stories like John Kerry used bad blood. And so what happened is that they were possessed not by themselves, but by their dream and by their goal. And then what that did is that caused them to not really have the freedom they needed to do the right thing, because they were so taken with being attached to this goal that they left out other important things, good things like being true and real about how they're treating people. So some key virtues, one of them would be self-control. Do we have a control over ourselves to actually apply ourselves to do what is good, right? For example, if you're a whistleblower, or if you have the occasion to be a whistleblower, which we all hope we never will, can you overcome your fear, right? And to act courageously, even in the face of what might happen if you blow the whistle and how your life will turn upside down, right? And then one of the other virtues that's very important is a virtue called practical wisdom. And this one kind of guides us. It is basically, how do we determine and develop the habit of being really good at deciding what it is that needs to be done? What is the right thing? Is it just something we get in our gut? Is it just imitating some other person that we respect? But what about when we really have to face an issue and we have to work it out and then figure out, well, now what am I going to do in this situation, right? Well, we need certain skills in our mind that help us to analyze the situation, to have control over our emotions, right? So that we can think clearly. Often when we have like a lot of emotions, we don't think clearly. So we're going to talk about some of these things, right? And so this presentation is about courage and sound judgment. And as you can tell, it's different from the kind of presentations that we normally have for CPE, you know? It's kind of like you got these regulations, you got these professional standards, you got all kinds of different things, or financial, you know, ways of doing things. And here we're talking about how do we conduct ourselves in the most responsible way in our work, so that when we face ethical issues, we do the right thing. There's some questions coming up. There was a whistleblower at the company. The question is, I thought there was a whistleblower at the company. Are you going to talk about them? I believe his uncle was on the board. Actually, his grandfather, George Shultz, former Secretary of State, was on the board. So we're going to jump from here to the material, and we're going to go through 15, if we can get through them, and if we don't, it's okay. But we've got 15 areas of how you can exercise wisdom in practical life, right? So key questions and habits. We can advance the slides. Okay, so key questions and habits that we want to have when we are trying to exercise practical wisdom. So you face this situation, you've got an ethical dilemma. You come from a meeting and somebody has just hatched something on you that it's like, now you've got a mess in your hands, okay? So the first thing you want to be able to do is get a hold of yourself. Can I compose myself and gather my wits so as to calm my mind and give reason priority over my emotions and distractions, right? So the way we're going to do this is I'm kind of doing a theory, and I'm going to get off of that real quick so Brent can talk about a lot of the facts, and we'll share some facts to give examples of these different pointers that come along. You might think of these 15 points, if we get through them, as the powers that a superhero who has sound judgment, who has all the powers of sound judgment, these are the powers that you could list that person needs to have, right? So Brent, why don't you jump in and give us a little bit of color on this? Brent's our color commentator for the sports show here.
Yeah, I think, again, there's several examples, and, I hit the timeline really fast, and I didn't talk about the whistleblower and all that, but as examples for each one of these, that's, what you'll get from the examples in Theranos. And I think what you'll see as we go through here is this is a very different kind of ethics training. Usually we spend a lot of time building up our technical capabilities, and then we often think ethics is just a yes or no, black or white answer. They're often very difficult situations, and there's a lot of things to be worked through, and that's what we're going to try to help you today, is be better at making decisions when ethical dilemmas hit you, like they did often at Theranos. Give you some examples on people that didn't control their emotions particularly well. Sunny Balwani is a great example of that. If you spend much time reading about him, he was basically what most of us would think of as a bully in the traditional sense. He did not suffer fools. He didn't want to be questioned, and he was often the hatchet man when people either questioned him or Elizabeth Holmes about anything, really. Loyalty was number one, and questioning them was not considered to be loyal. And so he really he's often described as a very angry, diminutive man. That's what a lot of I didn't call him that, but a lot in the book and in other places, they describe him as being very angry and very difficult for him to control his emotions. And there were several times he had to walk back on firing people because he did it in the heat of the moment. So he didn't take into account, he didn't take a pause and sit back and make a rational decision. Another example on the opposite side of that is actually Tyler Schultz. He's the whistleblower in the case, who actually spent a lot of time thinking through the repercussions of what he was about to do, working through his emotions, and you can even feel it sort of as you do your research and you read through what he went through. He a range of emotions from fear to anger to hope to being despondent. He joined the company wanting to believe in the vision, and he came off of the campus at Stanford hoping he could be part of something bigger than himself and change the world. And what he later found was that what he believed in was actually, he felt anyway in his mind, a lie. But he didn't just run to call the whistleblower line somewhere or calling the SEC. He actually sat down, took advice, pulled in people that knew, had been through these issues before, had more technical knowledge than him, and actually waded through a lot of data before he made up his mind. So you can sort of see the yin and yang of what happens when you don't kind of collect yourself and what happens when you do, from the story, from the downfall of Theranos.
So the virtue that would be involved here is this virtue of self-control, self-mastery. So in order to do what we actually want to do, in fact, in order to see and decide for ourselves what we want to do, we have to either calm our emotions at times when we're stirred up. The emotions are kind of like a team of horses pulling a chariot. And horses, what happens with horses? They get spooked. Sometimes they just take off running, right? And you got to slow them down. You got to rein them in. You got to turn them to go in the right direction, all these things. And this is part of what governing ourselves is about. We talk in our field a lot about corporate governance. And here we're talking about self-governance, right? And so one of the things that's an example from Tyler Schultz is we hear on his, he put out an Audible book earlier this month. And one of the things he tells about is in his early days in the company, that he would be working on things in the lab and seeing that this is not working. These devices aren't working. They're not effective. And what are we going to do? But then he would go and talk with Elizabeth Holmes, and Elizabeth would have this tremendous vision. She was so convincing. There's a world where you don't, where nobody, nobody dies unnecessarily, right? And things like that. She had these phrases that were amazing. She was so convincing. Her board of directors were all mostly non-medical people, but they were completely loyal to her. So Tyler, his mind would tell him this is not working, the lab's not working, the device is not doing its thing, the tests aren't working. And then he would go hear from Elizabeth, and the vision and the emotion, the elation of saying, well, I'm a part of this great thing, would kind of resolve all of his concerns. And then he'd go back to the lab, and then his concerns come back, right? Is how he described it. Okay, so this is one of the things that that we have to be able to do, because if we want to have good judgment and not make mistakes when we're making ethical decisions, then we need to rein in our emotions. Okay, so moving on to the next one, something that's very practical skill that we need to be able to do is simply to frame the issue and the circumstances, we've calmed our emotions, or we put them in perspective, knowing that, okay, I'm upset, but I'm going to look past that, and I'm going to try to reason out and put down on paper some of the things that are the considerations. What is at stake, right? Framing the issue. What's being asked of me? What's at stake? Who's most important in the big picture, right? So these are issues that, for example, Tyler had to deal with, because when he was looking at, when he had the opportunity, when John Carreyrou was able to contact him, Tyler was like, do I talk to this guy or not? If I talk to him, then David Boies and all these people are going to come after me, or the company's going to come after me, and it's going to be really miserable. And he ended up spending about $400,000 in legal fees. But he also was thinking, well, it's important that people don't get harmed. It's important that people have accurate diagnostics on their blood so that they can make reliable decisions about their healthcare that are life and death decisions, right? So he weighs these different things of what's at stake, right? And then he has to figure out how to weigh them back and forth. Brent, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go to the next slide for the sake of time, and then we'll jump into some examples on that one.
Hi, John. I just want to interrupt so I can push forth a poll for this, folks. We're really behind on polls.
Okay.
Thank you. Next poll up. I view ethical challenges as opportunities for personal growth. Rarely, sometimes, most of the time, always. I do appreciate you taking your moment and hitting the submit button. All right, I'm going to share those results. Thank you very much, folks. They're kind of across the board.
Nice, nice. So that's what our next pointer is. So, so far, if you're the ethical superhero, you want to be able to overcome your emotions, to think clearly and act clearly. You want to be able to frame the issues clearly and know what's important and what's not. And the next one is that you need to have a perspective toward this issue that you're facing. Next slide. That is going to be looking in a positive way at what may be a very difficult set of circumstances, and you may be facing some really difficult consequences of what might be happening, or consequences of what might happen if you do the right thing, right? And you look at it also and say, I don't want to be here in this situation. I don't want to be, having to face this. And so being able to frame the opportunity and say, okay, I'm not just going to look at the bad and all the bad that could happen, but I'm also going to look at this perspective from my development as a person in my life and see that there's an opportunity for me to grow in resilience. There's an opportunity for me to grow in the way that I take care of the people in my life. There's opportunities to grow in various different ways. So this is a practice that we want to be able to have when we're making ethical decisions, is seeing for ourselves an opportunity to develop as professionals and as persons in the midst of the adverse situations that we might face. Let's go to the next slide for the sake of time. So we have to consider the goods that are at stake, and we've got a list here. I hope you guys can see the slides. I've got a laptop and I can read it. It's just very small print. So what are the basic human goods at stake, right? We have to ask, if for the ethics, what's the right thing? We have to ask what's important, what's worthwhile, right? Because ethics means doing the right thing, and the right thing means doing what is actually good and worthwhile. So we can look at some examples of things that are goods, that are basic human goods. These are things that, people kind of across the board as human beings would conclude that, for example, life and health are good things. Truth, right? In the sense of freedom from ignorance, being able to actually know that you're perceiving reality as it is, right? And that people are not being spoofed and duped, or that we're being spoofed or duped. Good character, right? That we are honest and people with integrity. Justice, that people get their due. Sociability, the fact is that we're social creatures, as I mentioned, so we do well to cooperate with one another. We do well to look to, we want good for our neighbor in most cases. Not in all cases, right? A lot of, not everybody's exactly like that, but generally people, if you think about it, if you think about your neighbors at home, you probably have good feelings towards them unless there's some kind of nasty dispute, right? So Brent, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the goods that are at stake in some of the situations? I need to let you do some more speaking here.
I think if you look through, and I'd encourage you to do some more reading on this when we're done. There were lots of dilemmas where each of these come into play. So if you think about this idea of life and health, so there were lots of employees throughout the sort of 15-year period where Theranos was building up that came in with a desire to change the world, right? They had this feeling when they came in that they were part of something bigger than themselves, but began to quickly realize that there were real patient health issues here. But they have their own life issues in the need to make money for their families, right? They may be difficult to find another job. They've been threatened if they quit with litigation by the company and so forth. And even Theranos itself had this desire to change the world, and yet almost an equal driving factor, if you read between the lines, was a desire to make significant amounts of money. And so there's this sort of balance between one good and another, between life and health and financial success that has to be played out, and it plays out for multiple people throughout. Another interesting one that plays out, if you think about justice in the story, where you really should be giving to each person what is their due, right? What is fair, and be honest about what you're able to do, and faithful to your commitments. Well, unfortunately, throughout the story, there are a number of misrepresentations made, you know, to Walgreens, to Safeway, to the military, to investors. It doesn't talk a lot about interactions with the board, so I really can't tell. It's hard to tell what was going on there, but certainly there was a pattern of misrepresentations and a lack of justice in dealing with other people who deserve to have information and honesty. And interestingly enough, if you read through the story, Holmes herself seemed to have a problem with this idea of even good character, with representing situations accurately. Let's just put it that way. You know, when push came to shove and there was pressure, there was often stretching or misrepresentation of the facts, even in simple ways like on their website or in a speech regarding her uncle's death and how much it affected her, when the truth was she was completely estranged from her uncle and never really known him. So there was just lots of small ways where, you know, these virtues are sort of not practiced well, even though in theory it's easy to understand, but pressure makes people do strange things.
For example, the thing we were mentioning a minute ago about the desire to change the world and make health better for everyone, but at the same time having in order to do that, duping people, you know, there was a lot of things on the board. If you listen to Tyler's podcast called Heavier Than Water, and if you read Carrie Rue's book, you see that there was a lot of misrepresentation made to the board. And the board, it was basically recruited among very high-profile people who didn't really have much technical or health experience. And there was a board member who was a tech and not a healthcare board member, but he started to see that things, you know, that every time the board met, there'd be a new technical problem, but they were always just about to release the technology and go live, right? And so he kind of said, this is getting kind of fishy. And then he talked to some employees, and he went to the chair of the board and eventually was asked to leave the board because he was not rowing the boat in the same direction. And so we can see how we can lose sight of some things that are good because we're trying to do other things that are good, you know? So we have to make sure that we have an integrity in balancing the goods. Nancy, why don't we go with the next polling question, just because we're running quite late. And
thank you so much, John. We'll try to keep up. Your third polling question: freedom is the capacity to do that which is most excellent, do whatever I want, define reality for myself. Sorry, that was cute. I've had some complaints. We'll let this one go just a few seconds longer because some people have missed them. And if you have missed a poll, just mention it in the chat and I'll download that and make sure you get your CPEs. We do thank you for your patience. All right, I'm going to end that poll. It seems almost everyone's answered it, and I'm going to share those results.
Nice. Okay. We got some traction here, because doing that which is most excellent, it comports with this notion of virtue that we're kind of talking about as ethics in this case, right? That with freedom, pardon me for a second there, with freedom, we often think that we should be able to do whatever we want. We should decide things are how we want them to be. And you know, what can happen is that we don't have a certain kind of freedom that I've mentioned before, of perhaps we're too controlled by our emotions, or we're too controlled by greed, or we're too controlled by the desire for prestige. And then we lack the freedom, the ability to make tough decisions that include sacrifices, or that you know are arduous and things like that, because we are too attached. We're held back by these other things that we're attached to. So freedom is the ability to be able to do the most excellent things, right? Okay, so be principled is a consequence of what we've talked about these goods. right? So we look at these human goods about, life and health and truth and these different things. And then out of that, we can draw certain principles. And I'm just going to run through these that are some examples of these kinds of principles that we can use our minds to draw out of the nature of people and the nature of society. So good is to be done and pursued, and evil to be avoided. We need to give each person what is his or her due. Benevolence is a good thing, so we should desire the authentic good of others. The ends don't justify the means. These are things that are very simple that we've heard many times in our lives, but we've heard them because for centuries and millennia, people have been able to see that these are actually the good things, right? And it's not just in our society, but it's in societies across the world. To treat people with equal dignity, it's a very important matter. Collaboration, don't be a ball hog. It's good that we work together with other people, right? And act according to reason and not solely on the basis of emotions, because we have to actually see what is good as opposed to necessarily what we feel, right? Brent, were there any examples? Well, I guess we can go to the next slide.
Yeah, I was thinking just a couple of things that jumped to mind. I was going to say this earlier. There's one thing about the company itself that you will notice if you do some reading about it. And one is apparently intentionally, I mean, I'm sort of drawing a conclusion here, but the company was set up in a very siloed way so that people didn't share information. So back to that point of being collaborative, Holmes and Balwani had it set up such that if there was an issue in R&D, the person in marketing didn't know it, the person in commercial didn't know it, the person in finance and HR didn't know it, right? So it appears, again, it's hard to tell, I'm just sort of make a conclusion here, but that helped information only to centralize at the top, right? So you've got an intentional siloing of people, not letting them collaborate and work as teams and as human beings to flourish, but actually to ensure they were lonely on their own and not able to talk to other people as much as possible. Secondly, there was a real culture of I think you've heard this, I'm sure all of you have heard this before, fake it till you make it, which basically went on steroids. So instead of sort of exaggerating, it was, you think about the Walgreens partnership, it was not only is it almost ready, it's 100% ready to commercialize and we can roll it out nationally, right? So there's this sort of, we've given a deadline, we've made a promise, and she even says, I keep my promises. Well, what's the right promise to make? The right promise to make is the one that's honest, right? And is good for the other person, takes their good into account. And yet, under the guise of I keep my promise and under the guise of being honest or committed, she actually sort of commits vice instead of virtue by really defrauding ultimately Walgreens and their patients. So
yeah, just to point out and clarify, in case other people didn't know it, that the issue, the background on the Walgreens thing was that they went live, and this is really where the biggest fraud occurred, is that they went live with a product that was not safe, that was not able to determine the blood, not to be able to do the diagnoses that they represented that it would do, and they went live with real people. Brent, back to you. Sorry.
Hey, John, can we do one more poll?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, folks, I have pushed a poll out to you. This is number 4, I believe, or 5. I have trusted and competent ethical advisors to whom I can turn in any dilemma. True, kind of, not really. And again, I'll give you a few seconds to choose. Okay, I'm going to end that poll. Everybody get your answers in, hit submit. All right. And there are your results.
Great. All right. So 76% have trusted ethical advisors. That's great news. And the point of the question is simply that, to have us stop and ask ourselves, because if you don't have those advisors, then you should look and find someone that can be that trusted advisor for you. And another thing that you want to be able to do is you want to be able to, as you've heard many times, to have that money that is available, that you, if you can, that you have the capacity to leave your job if you're asked to do something that you can't do morally. Now, the ethical advisor issue fits with the next superpower, ethical superpower that we're talking about is drawing on experience. But we have to ask ourselves, do I have sufficient experience to see things as they really are in this situation and to competently deliberate, judge, and act on the issue at hand, right? First, do I have the experience, and then am I applying that experience, right? Brent, will you give us some examples from the Theranos about this?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I talked about one in the in that initial timeline when she, in the very early days in 2003, she's 18, I think. Holmes goes to a trusted advisor of hers, a PhD at Stanford, says, I have this idea for this patch. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change the world. Person says, no way, not possible. Don't do it. Like, you can't do it. It's basically medically impossible. Holmes sort of fires through that anyway and realizes that that is actually true. And it's sort of a, you know, we can all have this sort of weakness of character of feeling like we know everything. And I've certainly seen people in my life who seem to feel like they can take any issue on themselves, and I think some of us, and I've certainly had this feeling, you worry that if you ask for help, it's seen as kind of weakness, or, you know, you've been doing something for 20 years, shouldn't you know all right? Shouldn't you be able to work through these? And yet over and over again, these ethical dilemmas in the book, that's one. There's another where she's actually told point blank that this whole blood testing idea many times in the book and in the sort of whole saga is not possible. That small amounts of blood like that are not enough to do testing by people who are much older, more experienced, and actually medical professionals. She refuses to listen to any of that and actually fires all of them when the issues are raised. So, and on the other side, though, if you look at what Tyler Schultz did, he actually brings in lots of experience. He calls lots of people. He talks to current and former employees. He talks to a lawyer. He talks to medical professionals to make sure that he's getting all the data he can get. And there were several people in the book who ultimately help sort of write the story or out the issues. And all of them are not afraid to do that. They are the kind of people who say, I think I understand this, but maybe I'm not getting it. And they're not afraid to ask for help, to really completely deliberate the issue. And I definitely seen in my career helping people who've had issues and didn't handle them well, that often that happens. People are afraid, either afraid to raise the issue or afraid to ask for help or afraid to ask for more information to make a good decision. And ultimately the wrong decision gets made because they miss something. They just don't have the right input or enough input.
All right, let's go to the next one. So be teachable. So this is important, is that, you know, again, it's like as all of these are powers that we want to have in our arsenal. It's like we want to have these be qualities that we have for making decisions, and one of them is to be teachable. We got to, you know, you hear the cliche, but it's real that people don't know what they don't know. So we need to know, we need to be able to know when we don't know. You know, we need to be able to say, okay, I'm not expert in that particular thing, so I'm willing to be taught. I'm willing to go, rather than, you know, sometimes you can have the attitude, or not you, but somebody can have the attitude of you know, hey, I'm accomplished. I've been doing things for a long time, so this is a little bit different, but you know, and so you have the overconfidence problem that can come up, which is a big problem in the Theranos. Brent, you mentioned a little bit about Tyler seeking advice. What about, say, the board of directors? Excuse me, the investors in the beginning. You know, Tim Draper made an investment, and Tim Draper is a famous Silicon Valley investor who really is an advocate of entrepreneurship. He really tries to help. He's a billionaire. Always, I guess, he gives a lot of he invests a lot of money with the desire of promoting entrepreneurs that are to be successful. And so he was the first big name investor. And then there were also at that stage investors that were in the healthcare area. John Carreyrou describes that there was a healthcare investment firm that Elizabeth went and presented to, and they started asking her questions, and they were difficult questions. Eventually she gave up, threw up her hands, and walked out of the presentation. And of course, needless to say, they didn't invest. But somehow, Brent, I mean, what happened there in Silicon Valley that you, or would you like me to continue with the story? But the question of the investors kind of jumping into a herd mentality, it seems, right?
Sorry. Yes. No. You know, and it's a little bit difficult. Again, it's back to this point of not knowing what you don't know. But, you know, I think I'll give you an example. Maybe not even from the book, but just from recent. You know, in my own life, we had an issue. We were doing an investigation, and a person. And it turned out, as it turned out, there just was no intent to do anything wrong. But the person had in their mind that they knew better than everybody else on their staff, and had the end result in mind. Like they knew what the answer they wanted was, and they were going to drive that answer forward. You know, kind of regardless of what, you know, technical literature would tell you or what guidance would tell you, and actually. As it turned out, spent a career sort of like that. And it actually not a bad person at all. Apparently, you know, by all accounts, very good person to be around, treated employees well, but just was very super self-sure and certain that their view on things could be reasoned out somehow. And in this instance, it was that a fact you knew now could be relied on for a decision 6 months before when you didn't have the facts, right? So it's sort of people get in these quandaries and they look for ways to rationalize the answer as opposed to understanding the limitation they've got and getting good, wise counsel. And again, it happens in the book over and over again. But personal example.
There's a question that came up here that's good. Is that it's a long question. While there are clear ethical issues here, the key issue for me is the failure of regulatory oversight. Good point. How can anyone sell an unproven product for so long without regulatory approval? Any company can be structured so that information does not flow so that each area is a watertight compartment, but how can the outside world be fooled for so long in a regulated industry? Great question. And there's some very
Before you answer that, can we push a poll?
Let's do it.
Or you can answer it while I push the poll. How about that?
Yeah. Okay, well, then go ahead and give people time to do the poll.
Okay. I spend time reflecting on my actions, habits, and opportunities for personal growth. Daily, weekly, monthly, less often than monthly. Take a few seconds.
While people are thinking, I'll ruin part of the answer, which is they had really stuck themselves and had portrayed themselves as between regulation. So they had these things they call laboratory driven tests or laboratory execute tests. Anyway, even though she said, my vision is to put these in everybody's homes, if you created the test and executed it in a lab that was certified, you fell between FDA, CMS, and all these other regulatory bodies. Now, ultimately, when they found out about it, they realized what they were doing. But for the longest time, they were able to kind of stay beneath the radar under this guise that they had a certified lab. And it was certified for, you know, whatever it's worth. But nobody then checked what was going on at a detailed level in the lab. And it fell between some very arcane regulations that nobody was sure who regulated it. But John, you can.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Two things. One, great to see the result on the that people daily consider these things. That's kind of on the how-to that we're not going to get to, the how do we develop these habits. And I apologize to the audience that we're running far behind on getting through all of our points, but hopefully we're giving valuable insight as we go with these things, and we're gonna accelerate a lot here towards the end. In partial answer to what Brent was answering on the lab, like with the FDA and such, basically they were, as Brent said, they were kind of like surfing in between the regulatory agencies. There were two different agencies that regulate in these things. And then in addition, they basically pulled the wool over the regulators' eyes. There was an occasion where the regulators were, they had their research lab and their clinical lab on different floors. And so when they had the inspection, they had the lab that was working, you know, the lab that was compliant with with equipment from competitors. And they were testing stuff on competitors' equipment and saying it was tested on the Theranos equipment, right? Or they're showing the results. And so this is where some people on the inside, they were resigning, they were leaving, and this is like Tyler Schultz tells the whole story. Okay, so we draw on experience. Let's go to the next slide. We already did be teachable, and be shrewd. And this is just to say that we need to be able to, being shrewd is kind of like being able to read the room, to take in the cues, to know when something's suspicious, know when something's not quite right, and we get that. How do we get that? We get that through experience, right? And so people who've been around, who've done a lot of things, done a lot of interactions or transactions of a certain kind, right? Or maybe dealt with a lot of people professionally, or they have almost a second sense, right? That they know, they can see, they can read the room, they can read the people, they can read the faces, and they can accurately, quickly size up the situation and know when to be suspicious or when to be confident, and to be able to see through the impressions that people give. Brent, would you want to mention anything on that, or save for the next one?
Yeah, it just reminds me, it always reminds me of that sort of famous Ronald Reagan quote, trust but verify. There were a lot of trust going on and maybe a little less verification. But I think there are a couple of occasions where people actually push Holmes on some of her claims, you know, about accuracy, or about the size of the unit, or about a date, or about the revenue projections that she was making. And they're sort of shut down by someone else in the room, generally somebody else they're with, you know, somebody on the team who really wants to make the investment. There are several examples where there's a team of people who are assessing this investment, and a couple of people have issues and are shrewd enough to pick up clues of potential issues, and are shut down by somebody with a louder voice. And we've probably all picked that, you know, been through that in our careers, where you know, you've got a gut feeling because you've got the experience on this, and generally the person that shut them down was somebody who didn't have the experience but just wanted this to be true so badly they were willing to ignore all of the warning signs. And I think that's probably a lesson from the story too, is if you feel like something's wrong, follow it through and don't let somebody else, you know, shut down your intuition.
That's great, Brent. You know what I'm going to do is, because we've got 14 minutes left, I'm going to go through the rest of the points that we have, so we can at least know what are all the superpowers that we're aiming for in order to have sound judgment. And courage is going to come up a bit here as well. And then what we'll do is I'll go through all these points, and then we'll take Q&A, or you know, if there's not Q&A, we'll just talk about some examples among all of these points. So the next slide is okay, 9.9. There we go. Okay, use reason, which is, it sounds obvious. Of course, I'm a rational person, right? I know how to add things up, to go from premises to conclusions and all of that. But actually, it's not as simple as we, you know, I have on here on the slide, see the list of logical fallacies and ethical traps. And if anybody wants to see this slide, this deck in like a Word document format, or in like a smaller list, and then see these lists of logical fallacies and ethical traps, there's so many that we could do a whole presentation on them ourselves. But the fact is that we don't necessarily apply reason as much as we think, and I think it takes a lot of humility for us all to realize and to stop and go through these things. So if anybody wants to email me, my email's on the deck. I will be happy to send you a list of the logical fallacies and the ethical traps that happen. Things like herd mentality, or you know, like losing sight of the ethical issue because you focus on a financial issue, or vice versa. Next slide. Okay, putting first things first is basically, we talk about these things when we're trying to make a judgment of what to do. We're trying to decide what's important and what's more important and what's less important, what's essential, what's not essential, so we can balance these things. So the power of being able to evaluate and compare the goods that are at stake, right, is a power that we need to develop, right? And so this daily examination that 45% of you said, that you examine how you do things and whether you can improve yourself personally, these 15 points that we're going through are perhaps potential questions that you can ask yourself, that you say, okay, I want to build this skill of wise judgment. And then you can ask these questions about, okay, do I have a way? Do I know what are the do I rank those things and what's most important, what's next most important in the decisions I make? Let's go to the next one. Nancy, let's go to the next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, heed context, right? And these things sound very simple, and in fact they are, but the thing is that a lot of times, I mean, you know, I would say if I don't know how much money it would be, but if I were given an X amount of money, $1 for every time that somebody didn't do the obviously right thing or didn't take into consideration the factors that really were obviously needed to be taken into consideration, it happens all the time. Lots of people fail to look at the circumstances fully and understand that what works in one situation doesn't necessarily work in another situation. Or it may be that a lot of factors are aligning to do one thing, but then you take into this one other factor that changes everything, right? So we have to be aware of the context when we're making decisions. So that's one of the skills that we have to have in looking at the context. Let's go to number 12. Okay, being courageous.
Can I interrupt for one more poll, and then we
do it.
can final your comments? Thank you. Your last poll. My company and organization has systems and practices that help employees and management develop the habits of character needed to excel ethically. Strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree. And we do apologize, folks. There have been issues with the polls. I understand through the communications and chats. Don't hesitate to email me. You'll see my slide at the end of the deck if you've had any issues with polls, and we'll take a look at those problems. Thank you. I think we're almost ready to end this poll. If you hit your submits, and there are your results.
Great. Okay, so being courageous and cautious, we can talk about the example of Tyler, for example, which we'll get to in a minute. But the point here is that courage it's in the middle between recklessness, of being so daring and so bold that you don't necessarily think about what you're doing or the wisdom of what you're doing, and then you might be reckless and cause damage. Or on the other end, a person can be fearful, right? So courage is in the middle of that, right? It's a balance. And it's basically being able to do what needs to be done, despite the fact that it might be arduous or painful, right? But then caution is important for us to exercise and balance with that. And that's where the example of Tyler, I recommend the Audible book that he recently did, because you get a sense as he went through it. He's only 20 years old or so, but he did a good job of balancing being cautious and going one step at a time with being courageous to do what he felt he needed to do. Let's go to number 13. Lead your heart with your mind, right? So we talked about emotions earlier, and we can see how in the example from Theranos, there are a lot of investors, and even if you read about George Shultz and his loyalty to Elizabeth Holmes, it seems like there was an emotional attachment. She somehow was a very inspiring person that would inspire tremendous trust and loyalty in people. And so we have to be able to look beyond those emotions that we may experience. And the thing is that we also, when we see what the right thing to do is, we can use our mind to enlist our emotions to do what needs to be done. So with your mind, you can say, the right thing to do is this, and I don't feel like it, you know? And so then what you have to do is look at it and say, well, the right thing is to do, you know, Tyler might say the right thing is to speak to the journalist, but I'm afraid because I'm going to get pounded by lawyers. And he might say, well, it's the right, in fact, he did say, it's because it's for people's health, right? It's for the people not having health problems due to these devices. It's also, so he loved his grandfather, and he wanted his grandfather to have a chance to kind of get clear of this thing. And by bringing the truth to light, he felt that it would be good also for his grandfather, is one thing that he mentioned in his podcast. So, and that, you know, those were big judgments, but so he looks at that and he says, I don't feel like doing this thing, but I think it's the right thing to do. So then he finds reasons and motivates himself around those good reasons to do that arduous task. Let's go to the next one. And I think we're a little further along. Go ahead, 13, 14. Lead an examined life. And this is what we asked about earlier. And it really is, do we have a daily practice to implement and examine our behavior and our motivations and consider how to improve as a person, as a professional. Let's go to 15. Be humble and magnanimous. Elizabeth Holmes wanted to change the world drastically, right? You could say she was magnanimous. Magnanimous is the desire to do great things that are good for many people. And it's a natural tendency that we have. We want to do good. We want to make life better for people. And Elizabeth, you might look at her and say she was magnanimous, but she kind of ended up losing sight of things, right? And she lacked the humility in so many ways of knowing when she needed to ask for advice, of knowing when she didn't achieve what she thought she wanted to achieve, and therefore she needs to face the reality of it. So all of us, we want to be humble to see what reality is and see what our capabilities are, but we want to aspire to do great things to help people. So that's one of the superpowers that the super sound judgment, the super prudent person would desire to have. Now we're at 6 minutes left. If there are any questions, please serve them up, and we'll give a second for that. And here is the list of the logical fallacies and 2 lists of ethical dangers. Again, if we go to the slide that has Brent's email address and my email address at the end, you can contact me or Brent, and we'll provide those lists to you. And we can provide you a picture, a short document with the slides as with the content of the slides, if you like. Any questions that anybody wants to bring up?
There was an interesting one from earlier, John. I got kicked off, by the way, so I'm sorry if I disappeared for a bit. Luckily, I'd heard the presentation before, so I know what you said. But
well, unfortunately, they had to listen to me talk while you were gone.
My Wi-Fi apparently went down and came back, so I apologize. We were talking about leadership styles earlier, and Steve Jobs, and how Elizabeth was a devotee there, and leadership style potentially coming into play here, and who you model yourself after, right? Picking the right people that have the right virtues, as your sort of ethical guides, but also as your role models. So that was in the chat earlier, I noticed. It was an interesting point.
Good. Let me go back to some of the points we had earlier, and we'll consider in the last 4 minutes here some of the examples. Brent, I can serve up some questions to you. And I'm looking back at, one of the things we could do is kind of talk about some of these logical fallacies, actually.
So, John, there is a question here, by the way. I'm going to throw it at you.
So, I didn't scroll down to the questions.
Yeah, no. So it says, where do individuals typically fail in executing sound judgment? My answer is across the whole spectrum. But you go ahead, John. You probably got 1 or 2 in particular that you've seen.
No, that's true. And if you look at Theranos, you can see as a bit of an example of that. I mean, people failed to, again, the question at the beginning of the presentation came up, where was the board of directors? As you were giving the play-by-play of what happened at Theranos, one of the questions, where was the board of directors, right? Well, the board of directors didn't pick up on the cues that there was one director who picked up on the cues, and again, he kind of brought things out and was asked to leave. And same thing with investors. What I was getting at earlier about a lot of times what happens in Silicon Valley is that once you've got somebody who's a Stanford grad or a Stanford dropout who is sponsored in a sense or supported by a high-profile investor, all of a sudden they're golden. And a lot of investors just go based on that. And so what happened is people didn't look under the hood to see what's actually going on in this company. Can they actually do what they're saying they're going to do? And do they have the expertise, right? And so, so there's some of the things of being blind to the. So you can think about the powers that we talked about. For example, the board could be more teachable, right? By realizing that they don't have all the expertise they need to ask the right questions of the company, right? And so they should make sure that they have somebody asking those questions. Let's see, what other questions do we have here? You put up some information about Theranos, the movie Theranos. I think everybody can see these. Can everybody see the questions on is it a group chat? Or is it just the panelists that can see it?
I think the Q&A everybody can see. And the book's name is Bad Blood, by the way.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that was the other question. So Bad Blood.
Yeah.
You know, the other thing, John, just following up on your point from earlier, a lot of times, even when people are claiming to do due diligence, you can get suckered into this idea of only seeing what you want to see. So we talk to people all the time about confirmation bias. Don't just look for the facts that tend, or the information tends to prove what you want to believe. Be open-minded, and motivated blindness can play into that, right? People want it to be true so badly from a financial perspective and a good for society perspective, and just personal reasons, right? They want it to be true. They only look at what tends to prove what they believe, as opposed to opening their minds to kind of the broader picture. And that tends to be, you know, the downfall for a lot of people.
Well, I think we're coming up on the end, and I guess Elizabeth or Nancy, there's some concluding remarks you need to make or anything like that. If you could slip to this, there we go, the slide. There we go. So
Okay.
thank you for the opportunity, and we hope that it's been beneficial to people.
Well, thank you so very much, and I will pass it on to Nancy for finishing up anything that needs to be completed there. But thank you, everyone, for being present for the entire presentation, and thank you, Nancy and John and Brent and Brett, for helping put all this together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. This would be the end of our presentation. We do thank you for your participation during the webcast. Your CPE notification email, again, will be sent between 7 and 10 business days. If you had issues with poll, my email address is there on the screen. Feel free to send me an email and let me know which webinar, as in this webinar, you had issues with, and I will be sure to approve your CPE or credit. This does end the webcast, and again, thank you for participating. We wish you a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.